All right, we're going to begin William Wordsworth, and I want to introduce you to the best definition of poetry that I have seen before, and it was William Wordsworth's idea. He said poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. I love that because that's kind of how I think of poetry. Some people, when they are just filled up with emotion, they sing. And I wish I had that ability just to belt it out. Like, that must feel really nice. Those who were trying out for chapel band yesterday, I could hear you singing in the hallway, and I'm like, why didn't I have that talent? It's so cool. And those of you who dance and you make your whole body like expressive of your feelings, I'm just amazed by that. Or the artist in the room, amazing. So some people that don't have those skills, we just write, and our pen does all the work. My middle son, Micah, has started writing poetry, and I'm really proud of him. Like, he's starting to have like real adult feelings because I'm reading them in his poetry, and it's cool. So right prior to William Wordsworth was the Restoration era of British literature. And they didn't think of poetry this way at all. In fact, they really weren't big poetry writers. They were the satirical writers, like if you've ever heard of Gulliver's Travels, that was a big satirical piece. So they thought this was post-Shakespeare. They were like, Shakespeare, that's ridiculous. Like, why would you waste all your time just writing from the heart or trying to woo a girl with poetry? Like, writing should be for a purpose. And so they looked at it as a soapbox. Do you know what a soapbox is? Like, they used to carry out like a little crate or something and put it down in the middle of a very central location, stand on it and preach or defend their cause or whatever it was. So they used, during the Restoration era, the Enlightenment, they used writing as a soapbox, and their weapon was satire. And so their entire efforts were to write in order to bring about social change. And so they didn't believe in emotional writing at all. It was, we're using writing to bring a difference to the world. And it's not that that's a bad thing, it's just that I'm a romantic, and so I think writing stirs up from emotions that you have, and it's often just to express it personally or to someone you love. So I can't, for me personally, I can't really identify with, I'm just writing to bring like social justice or something. That's just not how I'm wired, but that's how they were wired. Well, Wordsworth, who I identify with to a large degree, he comes along and he's like, guys, seriously, like, can we stop and smell the roses, literally? Because he saw a lot of change in his lifetime, the Industrial Revolution, and like there's so much change in factories, and he kind of got a little disgruntled with the way society was turning out. So his efforts were to communicate with nature and to sort of get in touch with his feelings. He never used writing as a soapbox. That wasn't him at all. He wrote because he couldn't not write, because he had all these emotions and thoughts. He lived a really pretty life once he abandoned the city and moved out to the country. So for a minute, I'm going to explain to you kind of his locale and how that affects our tour that we're going to go on. Okay, we start out in London, and Wordsworth spent some time there too. And it is urban, and it is the most massive metropolis. Like, if you love New York City, you'll really like London. If you can't wait for storybook England, like, London isn't really, it's not going to be your favorite because it looks like any big city, really. I mean, there are some interesting things there, and I've planned some really cool days for us there, but it's not beautiful in a lot of parts. It's just, I mean, it's a big city. So Wordsworth kind of felt the same way. He's like, smokestacks everywhere, and factories, and busyness, and traffic. He didn't love that, so he moves far north to the Lake District. And on our tour, if you actually look at your t-shirt, you can trace the little paper airplane all the way up to the Lake District. That's our last stop. And for me, we save the best for last because we end up in the countryside. It's mountains and streams and sheep and waterfalls, and it's beautiful. We're gonna take a little riverboat cruise on the water, and it'll be lovely. So when you get there, you like breathe deeper because the air is so clean, and it's just nice to be outside. So that's the part where I'm staring out the window like my happy place right here. So Wordsworth felt the same way. He travels north and he's like, okay, this is what I'm talking about now. And so all of the really key romantic authors spent time in the Lake District. Some of his very best friends, like they were poets who got together and talked together and challenged each other's poetry and all of that. One even moved to the Lake District to be near Wordsworth because he was like, okay, you have found like the ideal spot for a poet. And his name was Coleridge. Robert Southey was another one. He was a poet laureate of England, so he's kind of a big deal too. He lived there too. The three of them they called the Lake Poets because all three of them moved to the lake to write poetry. Okay, another interesting tidbit. Last tour, we stayed in Keswick for the first time because our hotel is always kind of in a different location in the Lake District, and the only parameters I've given EF tours is it has to be historical building and it has to be amazing. And so it's usually the best food of the trip that we get there, and we end in just the coolest hotel. Every experience we've had has been amazing. But last time may have been my favorite. We were staying in a virtual castle, and we're staying near the city of Keswick, and I walk down into Keswick and I find that everything there is called Greta, which is pretty cool because that's my name. And so there was Greta Hall and Greta Car Wash and Greta Bridge and Greta Hall and like all of these things. It was really amazing, but they don't pronounce it Greta, they pronounce it Greta, which you'll hear probably people call me that because that's how they say it in British, Greta. And it means rocky. I don't identify with that. But it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And I'm like, Mr. Zeffo, we have to go see Greta Hall because this is really neat. And so we went up there just to take a picture like with me next to a building with my name on it because I don't ever see my name anywhere. And we got up there and I start reading about it. William Wordsworth stayed there once. The Browning stayed there once. Robert Southey stayed there. Like all of the most romantic poets ever in England stayed there at Greta Hall. I'm like, it's meant to be. Like, it's just crazy because my favorite era and just these deep connections. So I read something yesterday from EF where they're piecing together my tour, and she said something like, well, of course you'll be having dinner at the hotel while you're in Keswick. And I'm like, wait, does that mean we're staying at the castle again? I don't know for sure. They haven't confirmed that. And usually they make me wait for a while before they'll tell me hotels. But we may be there again. So if you want to go see Greta Hall with me, we'll just take a short walk and it's pretty cool. Anyway, all these authors lived there. While I was walking around looking for Greta Hall, I kind of got lost for a little bit. And I ended up in a subdivision, like a little cute little village. And this woman was checking her mailbox. And I said, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm just trying to find Greta Hall right now. And she goes, oh, Greta Hall? And I'm like, yes. And so we started talking, and she's like, do you study the poets? And I'm like, I teach poetry. And she started talking to me about this author who wrote near there, and she's using poetic terms like not many people use, onomatopoeic and all of this. I'm like, this woman is amazing. I thought I was 2 minutes from her inviting me in for tea, and I totally would have gone. But I don't know, the whole place just has the energy of poetry and literature, and those of you that are into that kind of thing, you'll love it. Those of you who aren't, you might turn over a new leaf after this, because it's pretty cool. Let me turn this slide for you. All right, you can add to these notes on your sheet if you want anything to add a little bit of clarity. I don't know why it's kind of jumping around, but William Wordsworth was born in 1770 and died in 1850. He had lost his mother and his father before he was 14. interesting connection. Mr. Zepho lost his mother and father when he was 14, actually the day before his birthday. He was educated at Hawkshead and Cambridge. Now, after he graduated from Cambridge, he spent some time in France. And I'm just going to spread a little bit of scandalous rumor, but he supposedly had an affair with a woman called Annette Ballon, and we believe that they had a child together. But he didn't marry her. He came back to England and established a home there, married a woman named Mary, and they had 5 children. But we think, based on some strange documentation, that he always supported her financially, like Annette's daughter or son, but there's a reason I'll talk about later that I think it was a daughter. But anyway, that is just sort of a mystery, and a lot of people think that that is what happened. But anyway, when he establishes himself in the Lake District, he invited his sister Dorothy to live with them. So Dorothy Wordsworth is also a famous writer, but more so for her journals. She took diaries of everything, every place they walked, and a lot of things like that. And so we know right where Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy walked through the Lake District, and we'll go on a walk and we'll know, like, this is where they were, you know. It's pretty cool. We also go to Wordsworth's home, and he actually had 2 of them. We're only going to visit one. At first, they lived at Dove Cottage, and it's tiny, and I don't even like to tour it, even though it's still there, because it's very, like, there's a fireplace going always, and so it's very smoky in there, but it is so claustrophobic, like, I'm like, get me out of here. I mean, that's how tiny of a place it is, so I'm not going to put you through that. After he started really making some money from his writings, he bought this massive estate, and it's called Rydal Mount, and that is where we will go. So it is probably, there are 2 places that are really intact, like, you know, this is how it was when this person lived here. So descendants of William Wordsworth still own that property, and they always have a curator who, that's their home at night, and during the day they open it up as a museum. And they say, don't sit there, that's William Wordsworth's chair. Don't sit there, you can't do that, because it's all still Wordsworth's belongings. His gardens have been maintained to look exactly how they looked when he was alive. He planted a huge daffodil garden for his sister Dorothy, and unfortunately it won't be in bloom when we're there, but right now it is going into full bloom and looks just like it did when he was alive. So I think you'll appreciate it when we get there, and you'll know, okay, this is cool. This is exactly what it looked like when he was here. Now, if this is why we do these lectures, because if we just showed up there and you don't know who William Wordsworth is, you'd be like, cool, nice front yard. But that's it. But after you study him and you learn his poetry, and then we go there and we study some more of his poetry in the ruins of an old abbey, like, you'll get it. And little light bulbs and, like, starry eyes and things like that will be happening. He was a big time walker, William Wordsworth. So in the Lake District, his whole life was walking and writing. That's what he did. And he believed that nature just revived his soul, and so he spent a lot of time in the outdoors. They estimate, based on his number of miles of walking per day, that he walked about 175,000 miles in his lifetime. That's a lot for every day of your walking life. And he lived to be pretty old, as you can see. So that's why it's cool that Dorothy journaled out his walking routes. So he has a huge lake in his front yard, beautiful view, and tons of land. He built a little place on the side of a cliff where he could, it was just a little covered shelter. He called it Summer's House. And it doesn't have windows or walls, really. It's just like an open-sided shed. And he could go out there on a rainy day overlooking the lake and write poetry. So it's pretty cool deal. The problem with Wordsworth is he grew to be a very grumpy old man. He outlived his wife and most of his children, and he became very disgruntled with what was happening in society. And so the Queen reached out to him and said, I would like for you to be our poet laureate. Have I explained to you what poet laureate is? Okay. Poet laureate is the representative poet of the nation. Okay, so the monarch usually selects a poet and says, you're the best in the nation, so I need you to write for me for special occasions, inaugurations, whatever. We have one in the United States too, but it's taken a little bit of a turn over the past few years. It used to be that the president selected the poet laureate, and pretty much they were the poet laureate during that president's term. Now it is elected by the Library of Congress, and it's only for a year term. Also, interestingly, this past fall, or maybe it's been almost a year now, they selected the first ever National Youth Poet Laureate. So there's like a 14-year-old girl who is our National Youth Poet. That's pretty cool. Now the National Poet receives a stipend of approximately $35,000 a year just to take the title, give speeches to the Library of Congress, write poetry for special occasions, and that kind of thing. So this is a trend that goes all the way back to maybe the 1600s in England, and then we kind of adopted a similar approach too. So William Wordsworth was one of the earlier poet laureates, but when the Queen offered it to him, he said, no thank you, I'm very tired and very grumpy and I'd rather not have to do anything. And he was already very wealthy from his earnings of poetry. He didn't really need the money. And she's like, oh, come on, I'll pay you a stipend every year and I won't ask you to do a thing. And he's like, well, free money, sure, why not? So he takes the title, never does a thing, and has it until he dies in 1850. And then they're like, okay, I guess we'll assign a new poet laureate. It's because the Queen there was no second best. There was nobody that even compared to him. So as long as he was living, she could not give the poet laureate to anybody else. That's pretty sweet. So he wrote a couple of famous works, lyrical ballads, and the Prelude. The Prelude is his sort of autobiography, and lyrical ballads he actually worked on with one of those other lake poets, Coleridge. But Coleridge was a drug addict, and so Wordsworth kind of broke up with him. He's like, we can't be friends because you won't choose to get healthy, and I can't watch you going through this mental decline. So they kind of parted ways over that. Now, let's move to the next thing. I'm going to sort of be a little bit vulnerable with you for a minute, and I'm okay with it because it is what it is. But I have a little journal that I got while I was at Wordsworth's Gardens once, and it's actually all of his poetry in this little journal. And I was reading through his poetry, and I had his rhythm and rhyme scheme kind of in my head, and I sat down in his gardens, and poetry just started kind of coming to me, so I wrote it in the back of the journal, and this is exactly how I wrote it then. And while any good author knows you have to continue to revise and edit, I haven't ever revised this one because I want it to be reminiscent of that moment that I was sitting in his gardens. So this is my first trip to England with students in 2006, which means you're the 7th tour to go. But this was a little poem I wrote, but I wanted to show you some things about it, and kind of I'll share the point with you in a minute. And by the way, that picture is exactly in his garden where I was sitting, so that was the view, and you can see the lake out there. My heart's been planted among the lavender stretching to Rattle water. My soul breathes deep of the garden air, and this a happiest hour. Joyous lines like falls through fells would pour through poet's pen, if such a place safe showed my hearth and mounted up my hat. Few words could match the worth beheld along the greening terrace, into summer's house of flowers and rocks and trees inspired. doubtless the poet's dancing daffodils breathe life to me as well. So I want to point out a few things. First, the lavender, there was lavender planted there in the garden. Rydal Water is the name of the lake out in Wordsworth's front yard. And the falls through fells, the fells are what they call those little, like, small hills, and they're waterfalls just running off, not big waterfalls, just trickles of water coming off the mountainside, and they're everywhere, and they're really pretty. So lines would come through the pen like the waterfalls through the fells. Notice mounted is capitalized because I'm at Rydal Mount, which is his home. And so it says that basically I would be a poet too if I lived here because it's so beautiful and inspirational, like you almost can't help yourself. Then in the next line I capitalized words and worth because that's his name. Terrace was what he called this part of the garden. I told you what Summer's house is up on top of the cliff. And doubtless the poet's dancing daffodils breathe life to me as well. And that takes us to the poem that we're going to study next. It's the first poem by William Wordsworth that I want to spend some time with. And we call it the Daffodil Poem, although he didn't title it, but that's what it is. So I would propose that when we're there in Wordsworth's garden, have a journal with you that day or something to write with, and we'll have some free time just to explore his gardens. Some of you may be hiking through the woods. Some of you could find a tree to sit in or a place in the gardens and just maybe write, and you might be astounded, like, it's true, the poetry like comes up out of the ground here, and you find yourself writing poetry. All right, let's go to the daffodil poem. All right, do I have a volunteer who would read this for us? Or 4 people, you can each take a stanza.
I'll take stanza 1.
Thank you.
Woo!
All right, 3 more volunteers, let's go.
I'll do one of them.
Number 2, number 3, 1 more.
I can do 4.
Number 4, okay, perfect.
Alright.
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lakes beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze.
Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of the bay. 10,000 saw I at glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance.
The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be gay in such a just company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth to show me had brought.
For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils.
Miss Burton, can I ask you a favor? Yes. Do you think Donnie could get me in the English office at the end of the hall during our break time? Okay. So you have questions in your handout. So if you'll turn over a couple of pages, you'll see that there are questions to guide our conversation about the daffodil poem. And for a second, we'll just talk about daffodils because they became really important to William Wordsworth, and in hindsight, they're kind of important to me as well, just because of the connection that I feel to Wordsworth. So I'm going to offer you an extra credit opportunity. You can only do one of these during the whole process, so if you've already been to Shakespeare Tavern, you could certainly do this, but you wouldn't get more and more and more extra credit. But I'm going to say Gibbs Gardens, it's in Ball Ground, Georgia, about a 45-minute or so drive from here. They have a daffodil display coming up in the next 2 months that would blow your mind. It is the most number of daffodils planted in any one place in the world, I think, is what I read. So I want to go there desperately. I actually haven't been before. I drool every spring and then haven't found a time to go yet. But I think if you were there reading this poem by William Wordsworth, you would get it. You know, I mean, how cool. So extra credit if you go to Gibbs and see the daffodil display. But you would have to watch on Facebook Gibbs Gardens to see when the daffodils are at their prime. You don't want to go too early when there's just a few, or too late when they're dying. You want to go when there's a billion gazillion and they're gorgeous. Wordsworth, on one of his little walks, was walking around and just kind of turns a corner, and there he sees hundreds and hundreds of daffodils, maybe like you would see at Gibbs Gardens. And it shocked him, and this is the poem he wrote in response to that occasion. So we're going to kind of break it down and look at the literary aspects of it. The happy place then is this, the view of all these daffodils beside a lake. And we know that because it says they stretched in a never-ending line along the margin of a bay. So they're right by the waters. And then he talks about the waves, so you can kind of picture the setting. Let's go to number 3, and then we'll come back to number 2 in a little bit. I'm looking for ways daffodils are personified. Who knows the definition of personification? What is it, Josh?
It's like when you give lifelike qualities to something that is not, or maybe human-like qualities
Yes.
to things that aren't.
Yes. You're giving human characteristics to a non-human thing. So personification, person characteristics to a non-person thing. So I want you to look through here, skim through and see, where does it sound like daffodils are people?
When they toss their heads.
They tossed their heads. You know what a daffodil looks like, right? You can see on here how the little center part might look like a face, and then it has almost this crown or bright blonde hair around it. And then the way they wave in the breeze, you know, it looks like they have a little face. Where else?
Dancing.
They dance. So it's the movement of the daffodils in the breeze, just bobbing along. So if you go to Gibbs, you've got to just look at them like little people dancing, hanging out. It's sort of cute. There's one more. Can you find it? Miss Barton, can you shut that door? Thank you, thank you. There's a couple of words that we would normally only use for people, but it's here used for daffodils. First stanza.
Crowd.
Crowd. A crowd or a host, they're together, a whole crowd of daffodils. We would usually talk about a crowd of people or a host of people. All right, what is simile?
Like or as.
Like or as, to compare two things. Sometimes so as well, but it's a little harder to find because you don't want to get it confused with a conjunction or something. But if I said, if I used so in the sense of in the same way as, so as or like. So can you find some examples of similes in the poem?
As the stars that shine.
Continuous as the stars that shine. You know those really starry nights, you walk out and you look up and it's just like, oh my gosh, there's more stars than there are sky right now. That's how he saw the daffodils. They were like innumerable, so many of them, continuous as the stars that shine. Where's the other simile?
The first one.
Lonely as a cloud.
I heard first line, I wandered lonely as a cloud. You know, when you sometimes look up in the sky and there's just a single little cloud and it might be kind of low and it just seems to be bobbing around a little bit, but he feels loneliness. So the tone at the beginning is lonely or isolated. because he's wandering around just by himself, lonely as a cloud. When all at once he saw the daffodils. So the when all at once gives us a suddenly. So he was sort of morose, dopey, like Eeyore, like blah, da, 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 da. And then he sees the flowers and he's like, oh, like it makes him happy, just like immediately changes his mood. What kind of things for you can change your mood like on a dime?
Chick-fil-A sign.
Chick-fil-A sign, that's a good one. Donuts, dogs.
Yeah, true, animals.
What about songs on the radio? A certain song
Yeah.
comes on,
Sports.
mood can totally shift.
Sports. That absolutely destroyed me.
I think I heard Alabama scoring and taking the national championship.
Georgia, national champion.
All of those things can change your mood. How many of you are affected by a sunrise or a sunset in that way?
Sometimes.
I will drive my car in a ditch. Like all of a sudden I turn a corner and there's like the sunset and I'm like, meh. I mean, I love it. So for Wordsworth, nature has that effect on him too. He sees the daffodils, it changes everything. All right, let's look back at the poem. Skip down to the line, a poet, in the third stanza. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. Can you guess in context what jocund means? Who is the company?
The daffodils.
And so what do you think they're like?
Fun.
Fun, sprightly,
Great time.
happy, like you could not, okay, you know the old context of gay. How does he mean it? Happy. All right. A poet could not be happy surrounded by such happiness. Did you know yellow is a sign of happiness and friendship? So he feels that sort of friendship with the daffodils, like, okay, I can't be sad. He came in wandering lonely as a cloud. He sees them, he's like, oh, they're so cute, you know, and it just brings happiness to him. Now, there's a line from a play that talks about how poets and saints, and she just means Christians, see the world a little differently from everybody else. Were any of you in Our Town? The play here? Did any of you see Our Town? Okay. In Our Town, that's when the main character says, does anybody ever really see the earth for what it is? And the response is, poets and saints, maybe they do some. Okay, so there's something about the eye of a Christian. We see the world a little bit differently. Can you think why? Why do we see nature differently than everybody else?
Because we see that it has a design.
Jesus.
We see the design of it, we see the creator through it. Okay, I don't like exercise, you can probably tell, but I do love nature. And so the fastest way to get me to exercise is to say, hey, there's a really pretty view if you climb that mountain. I'm like, okay, let's do it, you know. Or Miss Gassman will say to me, all right, we're going hiking, we're on Hickory Trail, let's do it. I'm like, okay. But I get out there and it just, like, my stress just melts away because I'm seeing the little stream under the bridge and I'm climbing and I see all the trees and I'm just like, oh my gosh, God is the most amazing artist and creator. That's why we see things a little differently. Poets see the world a little differently too, because they're looking for the beauty around them and they feel deeply. Do you know the word aesthete? What is aesthetics? Okay, aesthetics is the design of something or the beauty of something, right? If you do a poster for class and your teacher says aesthetics matter, they mean the design of it, the look of it, the prettiness of it counts. So an aesthete is someone who is largely affected by the fine arts, dance, music, poetry, literature. You just see things on a deeper level. If you cry in Publix commercials, you're probably an aesthete. If you go to all of our theater performances and they just like move your soul, you're an aesthete, okay? Wordsworth is an aesthete. Greta Zepho is an aesthete, you know. So those of us who are both poets and Christians, the world looks different to us. So Wordsworth, unfortunately, only has the poetry experience. He was not a Christian, best I can tell. We'll talk more about that at another time. But he says a poet couldn't not be happy in such a happy company. Let's look down a couple of more lines. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. He didn't recognize in that moment the effect it would have on him later. Like, yes, he thought it was pretty, it changed his mood, but he couldn't have guessed that it would have a lasting impact on him. I want you to think for just a minute about an experience that you've had, a vacation you went on, something that in the moment it was cool, but it didn't really have lasting impact, or you didn't guess that it would. But now, after some separation or some time, you can point back to that moment like, okay, that was cool. It may have been a sermon that you heard. Everybody have an experience like that? Anything bad? Okay, England is going to be that. I guarantee it. Some of you will get it in the moment. You'll be like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And others of you may be like, all right, this is fun. I'm not at home. I'm with my friends. We're seeing some cool stuff. But 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you're like, I did not know the effect it would have on me. So I studied at Cambridge University, in 1995, and honestly, I was really homesick because I was gone for 3.5 months, and I had never been away from home before. I had my 20th birthday while I was there, and like it was just, for me, I was getting academic credit. I recognized that it was pretty, but I wouldn't say that I was really living in it. And one of the guys on the trip with me came up one day, well into the trip, and literally shook me by the shoulders, and he's like, you're missing it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, stop living in the US. You've got to get your head here. Like, go out and have fun. Like, do some different things. You're like stuck up in your dorm room writing letters to your boyfriend. Like, get over it. And I was like stunned because we weren't that close. I'm like, I cannot believe he's saying these things to me. And then later I'm like, he's totally right. So I started really enjoying myself then, and I went all in. I invested. I started exploring and making friends and not writing home as often, and I fell in love with England. But even then, I'm like, okay, pretty cool experience. And then I had a lot of fun traveling around Europe for 10 days after the tour. But it was not until, well, it did really change who I was almost immediately. When I got back, I was not the same person as I left. But then in 2004-ish, Dr. Tilley came up to me on campus. I had just been hired, and he said, hey, Miss Zepho, you want to help me start a study abroad program? Because he was one of the ones who picked me to go to England in '95 when we were both at Lee University. And I'm like, sure thing, and I started working on it that day. Could I have even guessed when I went as a college student in the 90s that it would be my greatest passion today to get to take you there? And even though it's a miniature trip, like, you won't be gone long enough to feel extreme homesickness. So you just get the best of it, like this whirlwind tour. But I could not have guessed at that time the effect it would have on me later. He doesn't either. He gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to him had brought. Now let's go to the last stanza to see the lasting effect that it had on him. For often, when on my couch I lie, like now, when he's writing this, in vacant or in pensive mood. Okay, what's pensive? Thoughtful. So if that is contrasted with vacant, what does vacant mean?
Your mind is blank.
Blank-minded. I read an article that said guys have the ability to not be thinking. Like if you say, what are you thinking? And they're like, nothing, that can be true. What?
Extra.
Girls, are we so jealous of that? Like, I don't think we have that off switch. Our minds are always going. But William Wordsworth, he says whether his mind is absent or full, vacant or pensive, they flash upon that inward eye. What they? Who they? The daffodils, when they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. Okay, the inward eye, the bliss of solitude. What must that inward eye be?
Like when you're closed, like your eyes are closed, you're sleeping, you're kind of like in like that dreamy like state, like thinking about it then, almost dreaming about the moment again.
What is it that can give you a sense of happiness when you're all by yourself? In your mind. I'm wanting you to get to memory. It's the memories. Because as your mind just kind of floats around and suddenly you remember a happy thing and your heart just swells up with that memory. Okay, so the inward eye is the memory. It's seeing things that were. And that's the bliss of solitude. Okay, we call that daydreaming. You know? And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So if you can visualize that last line, now months, if not years, have passed. Wordsworth might find himself on a couch, and it doesn't matter whether his mind is full or empty. If suddenly he thinks back to the daffodils, his heart fills with pleasure again. That's why when I start talking about England, I'm visualizing it as I'm talking about it, and I start, like, my eyes are twinkling, and I'm like, ah, because I see it in my inward eye, you know, and it's the bliss. Is the bliss, the memory of something so delightful and beautiful. I don't care if you think I'm weird, because you're going to be weird after I take you abroad, too. Okay, see if you were able to answer every question, 1 through 7. Any questions? All right, Cole, can you hit that record button to stop it? And we're going to take about a 10-minute break. Okay, so 9:10 we'll meet back, all right?